They fenced off my ranch without warning. No notice, no consultation, no apology. Just one morning I woke up to the sight of towering metal posts and thick, rusting wire cutting across my property. They didn't know who they were messing with. But I did. The day was calm, as it always was when the sun just begins to peek over the distant hills. The birds were in the trees, singing their usual morning tune. I stepped outside, taking in the fresh, crisp air, as I did every morning. My boots pressed into the dirt path that led up to the old barn, the familiar sound of gravel underfoot. It was peaceful here, in this place I had fought so hard to own and protect. This ranch wasn't just land to me, it was my legacy, my history. But today, something was wrong. As I looked toward the front of the property, something unfamiliar caught my eye. A dark, menacing line cutting through the vibrant green of the pasture. A fence. No, not just a fence. An imposing, brand-new fence that had been erected in the dead of night. I didn't panic. That would have been a mistake. Instead, I walked closer, each step deliberate. A quiet determination built within me. This land was mine. It had always been mine. And no one was going to take it away. Not now, not ever. The fence wasn't even placed at the edge of my property line. It was too far into my land. Far enough to be a violation. A blatant, flagrant act of overreach. I recognized the signs of HOA involvement immediately. Those metal posts? Standard issue for any HOA project that's being rushed. The wire? Typical for a boundary dispute. It didn't take long for me to piece it together. A neighbor, or worse, a group of them, had decided they wanted control over something that wasn't theirs. Something I wasn't going to let them have. I stood there for a moment, the weight of the situation settling on me. But I wasn't angry. I wasn't even frustrated. I knew this wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. What I was, however, was deeply disappointed. It wasn't just the fence. It was the lack of respect, the sheer audacity to come onto my land, without any conversation, without any forewarning, and make a decision for me. It was a feeling I knew, all too well, the quiet injustice that slithers in unnoticed, just beneath the surface of your daily life. The moment when someone or something challenges the peace you've built, testing the strength of the boundaries you've spent years constructing, both literally and metaphorically. I didn't need to say a word yet. No immediate action was necessary. The first step, as always, was to understand exactly what I was up against. I went back inside my house, grabbed my coffee, and sat at my desk, scanning through the documents that confirmed my ownership. Property deeds, surveyor reports. I kept everything filed away neatly. I never trusted the idea of just remembering the legalities. The county's records were clear. I was the land commissioner. Not just a landowner, but the one who managed the land around here. Any attempt to infringe on my property line would be met with serious consequences. But for now, I needed more than just knowledge. I needed strategy. The HOA had overstepped, but this wasn't just about an illegal fence. It was personal. I'd worked for this ranch. I'd fought tooth and nail to keep it, and now some group of faceless people thought they could come in and change it without warning. They weren't just attacking my property, they were attacking everything I stood for. I reached out to a lawyer I'd known for years. He was good, precise, no nonsense. We'd worked together on a couple of cases in the past, but this one was going to be different. I knew it. The HOA was going to underestimate me. They were going to think I would back down, that I would just accept their little power play. But they hadn't met me yet. The lawyer asked for the details, and I gave them. We discussed the legal boundaries of the property, the history of the land, the laws regarding HOA control, and the current building codes that any new constructions or additions had to follow. Everything about this was wrong. They'd never had the right to place that fence there, and if they thought they could get away with it, they were gravely mistaken. Then, I did something the HOA wouldn't have expected. I made a few calls to some of the neighbors. I knew some of them, but others I had kept at arm's length, unwilling to involve myself too deeply in local politics. That was the game they played. The one where if you kept quiet and compliant, they would leave you alone. But I wasn't about to play by their rules anymore. When I spoke to the first neighbor, an older gentleman who lived a couple of miles down the road, he didn't sound surprised. In fact, he'd been hearing rumors about the HOA getting more aggressive in the area, taking liberties with properties they didn't own. It seemed like they were pushing for more control, quietly but steadily without any of the usual procedures. The county was already dealing with a handful of complaints, but no one had really dared to speak up about it. Until now. The news spread, quickly and soon. I had a small network of allies who knew exactly what I was up against. I wasn't alone in this. The more I gathered, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just about one fence or one ranch. This was about an HOA flexing its power over landowners, taking advantage of their ignorance and fear. The people who lived in the area, the ones who had their own plots of land, were scared to stand up to the board because they thought they'd be targeted. They thought they'd lose everything. But I wasn't scared. I had seen enough of the world to know when to stand my ground and when to make sure others followed suit. The next morning, the HOA sent a letter. It was a standard letter, polite on the surface with an aggressive undertone, warning me about unapproved structures and demanding that I rectify the situation within 30 days or face fines and potential legal action. They included a vague threat of further escalation if I didn't comply. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I sat back, studying the letter, considering my options. I'd been in tough situations before. I knew how to move slowly and precisely, how to anticipate their next move and stay one step ahead. The key, as always, was patience. I wasn't going to fight them on their terms. I was going to make them fight on mine. My next move was to gather everything, every document, every piece of evidence, every scrap of information I could find. I wasn't just going to rely on my own legal standing. I was going to expose them for what they were, an overreaching, corrupt system that trampled on the rights of landowners. The days following the HOA's letter passed in a quiet blur, each one feeling like a slow tightening of a noose around their own necks. I spent those days preparing, though I never let on to the HOA that I had already begun my counter-offensive. I moved deliberately like a chess player, setting the pieces in place, knowing that every move would count. The people around me, including the HOA board, thought this would be easy. They thought I'd back down. They had no idea that they were walking into a carefully constructed trap. I started by digging into the history of the HOA. Who were these people who felt entitled to encroach on my property? What kind of authority did they have over my land? My lawyer had told me that HOA's power was limited by county laws, but they had grown far too comfortable in recent years. They had started to view themselves as local rulers, passing down edicts with little to no oversight. But that arrogance had a price, and I was going to make them pay it. The more I dug, the more I learned about their methods. This wasn't just about controlling the landscape or enforcing rules. This was about power, about unchecked authority, and about exploiting the vulnerability of others. Many of the violations they issued, including the one concerning the fence, were based on vague rules that they themselves selectively enforced. There were neighbors who had received citations for even the smallest of infractions. A garden fence, too tall, a tree planted a foot outside a designated line. The HOA didn't want peace. They wanted control. It was a pattern that became glaringly obvious as I uncovered more. But I wasn't the only one they had targeted. Over the years, several others had been intimidated or forced to comply under threat of fines, lawsuits, and even eviction from the community. Some had sold their homes under pressure, others simply gave up. But there was one thing they all had in common. They hadn't fought back. That was the mistake they made. They let fear dictate their actions. I wasn't going to make that mistake. I set up a meeting with the county land commissioner's office. While I was there, I asked to see any records related to property disputes and violations in the area. It wasn't long before the clerk handed me a thick folder containing a number of complaints and appeals, many of which involved the HOA's increasingly aggressive actions. Some were related to fencing, others to arbitrary fines. It was clear the HOA had been operating with little regard for the law. They had become a law unto themselves, playing fast and loose with zoning laws, property boundaries, and even basic decency. The next step was to get a second opinion on the property line. I called in a local surveyor I trusted, a no-nonsense guy named Ben who had worked on several projects in the area. When I told him what had happened, he didn't flinch. "I've heard stories about that HOA," he said, shaking his head. "They've been getting bolder lately, but they can't get away with this." We spent the next few days marking out the true boundaries of my land, carefully measuring every corner, every post, every inch of the property. Ben's survey confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had placed the fence far beyond its jurisdiction. They had not only encroached on my land, but they had also blocked access to my own property, which would pose serious challenges to me in the future. The fence wasn't just an eyesore, it was an active infringement on my rights. If I let this slide, I was setting a precedent for them to do the same to others in the future. I also made a point of recording the fence and its placement from every angle, taking pictures and video footage. I knew that in the court of law, evidence was everything, so I made sure to capture the details, the gap between my property line and the fence, the way the posts cut across the edge of my land, the lack of any formal notice or permits for such construction. But I wasn't just gathering evidence for myself. I was building a case that would put the HOA on trial in front of the people who needed to hear it, the residents of the community, the local authorities, and most importantly, the media. What the HOA didn't realize was that their small-scale bullying was about to become a public spectacle. As the weeks wore on, the HOA continued to escalate its tactics. They sent another letter, this time demanding that I remove the unauthorized structures and threatening hefty fines if I didn't comply. The language was more forceful, more accusatory, as if they truly believed I'd just cave in and hand over control of my land to them. I almost laughed when I read it, but I didn't. Instead, I sent a letter back, not one of defiance, but of quiet authority. In the letter, I calmly stated that I was aware of the boundaries of my property, that I had consulted with experts, and that the HOA had violated several zoning laws by placing the fence where it stood. I included a detailed list of the violations along with the evidence I had gathered, the surveyor's report, the photographs, the legal documents. I also made it clear that if they didn't remove the fence and issue an apology, I would take legal action. But the final line of the letter was what I knew would get their attention. "This is not a negotiation, it is a matter of law." I didn't expect them to take it well, but I wasn't worried about that. I had prepared for their reaction, and when it came, I knew exactly what I would do next. The HOA board members were not prepared for what followed. They believed they were untouchable, that no one would challenge them. They didn't realize that they had already overstepped, and in doing so, they had set themselves up for a fall. It started with a public meeting, one where I knew they would try to dismiss my claims. I had already spoken to several residents who were fed up with the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. I didn't need to incite a crowd. I just needed to give them the information they hadn't had before. Armed with evidence, I stood in front of the HOA board during a town meeting, presenting my case as calmly as I could. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't shout. I simply spoke the truth. I showed them the documents, the surveyor's report, the photos, and video footage. I didn't need to say much. The evidence spoke for itself. The tension in the room was palpable, but I didn't flinch. I wasn't going anywhere. This wasn't just my fight anymore, it was everyone's. The community had been wronged, and I had the power to make it right. One of the board members stood up, attempting to dismiss the claims as technicalities, but I had prepared for this. I calmly pointed out the legal violations they had committed, the specific ordinances they had ignored, and the personal toll their actions had taken on me and my family. The room grew silent. It wasn't just my voice that was shaking now. It was theirs. They had underestimated me, and it was too late to backpedal. The final blow came when the local news station showed up. Word had gotten out, and a reporter arrived with a camera crew, ready to cover the story. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the HOA's power being exposed to the light of day. I wasn't just defending my property. I was standing up for everyone who had been bullied into silence by an unchecked, corrupt system. The media caught every moment of it, the uncomfortable silence in the room, the hesitation in the faces of the HOA board members. The moment was theirs, and it was mine. As I left that meeting, I felt the weight of years of injustice slowly lifting. But this was only the beginning. I knew they wouldn't back down easily. But they also knew they had lost their footing. The fence was coming down. The board members were going to be held accountable, and the truth would have its day in the light. And through it all, I remained quiet. No shouting, no drama, just the calm assurance of someone who knew the system, who understood the law, and who was prepared to fight for what was right. The evening after the meeting felt strangely anticlimactic. It was a moment I had prepared for, a pivotal turning point, and yet, when I left the town hall, I found myself in a kind of quiet pause, as if everything had already been decided. I knew the HOA wasn't going to go down without a fight. This wasn't the end, just the beginning of a new phase. But for now, they were reeling, uncertain, and I couldn't help but relish that uncertainty. The next few days were tense but deliberate. I could sense the HOA's attempts to regroup, their feigned confidence wearing thin. They began to send out more letters, subtly pushing back, trying to discredit my claims with legal jargon and vague references to HOA rules. But they couldn't ignore the truth. They couldn't unsee the evidence. Every new letter they sent was a desperate attempt to regain control, but with every step they lost more and more of their footing. I kept my distance, both physically and emotionally. There was no need for further confrontation. The wheels of the law were turning quietly but powerfully. I had filed a formal complaint with the county zoning department, demanding that the HOA remove the illegal fence. My lawyer had also sent a letter of intent to file a lawsuit if the situation wasn't resolved within 30 days. All the while, I continued gathering evidence, keeping records of the HOA's communication, documenting their attempts to intimidate and harass me, and speaking with neighbors who had suffered in silence for too long. And then, the final card was played. I was sitting at my desk one morning going over more legal documents when I received a phone call from the county commissioner's office. The voice on the other end was calm, but there was an undeniable sense of urgency. "We've received the survey, the complaint, and the evidence you submitted," the voice said. "After reviewing everything, we found the HOA's actions to be in violation of multiple zoning codes and county regulations. You've built a solid case." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but I didn't let myself celebrate. Not yet. There was still work to do. The county was ready to take action. They would send a team to inspect the fence and its placement. They would also launch an investigation into the HOA's practices, which had been a growing concern for years. I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about everyone who had been quietly suffering under the weight of the HOA's overreach. My fight had become their fight too. The days of unchecked authority were over. A week later, the county officials arrived at my property. They came in with the surveyor's report in hand, ready to assess the situation. As they walked along the property line, I watched them nod in agreement. The fence was undeniably placed in violation of county laws, and the HOA had no legal basis for its construction. The inspector took measurements, snapped photos, and carefully noted everything, each step confirming what I had already known. The HOA had no right to dictate my property, but what happened next caught me by surprise. As the county team prepared their report, one of the officials leaned in, speaking in a low voice. "I'm not sure if you know this, but the HOA's been under investigation for other violations. This might be the final straw." I could feel my pulse quicken, but I kept my expression neutral. "What kind of violations?" "There have been complaints about their dealings with other homeowners. Intimidation, false fines, property disputes. This could open the door for a larger investigation into their practices." The thought of the HOA being held accountable on a broader scale gave me a quiet sense of satisfaction. They had dug their own grave, overstepping the boundaries of what they could control. And now it was all unraveling. Over the next few weeks, the HOA tried to hold their ground. They issued a formal statement denying any wrongdoing and insisted that they had acted within their rights. But the more they tried to justify their actions, the more people began to see the cracks in their facade. The media coverage had been relentless, and the public sentiment was beginning to turn in my favor. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out were now coming forward, sharing their own stories of how the HOA had bullied them into submission. The tide was turning. Then the bombshell hit. A local news outlet uncovered a trail of unethical practices, financial mismanagement, and a series of questionable decisions made by the HOA board members. It was clear they had been exploiting their power for personal gain, and the community was outraged. The board's credibility had evaporated, and it wasn't long before calls for their resignation began circulating. The pressure was mounting, and the HOA was beginning to crack under the weight of its own lies. I watched the headlines as they appeared on my screen. HOA board members under investigation. Residents speak out against corrupt HOA practices. Each story felt like a small victory, but I remained focused. This wasn't just about exposing them. It was about ensuring they couldn't continue to harm others. It was about restoring justice and fairness to a community that had been forced to live in fear for far too long. And then came the final moment. The moment I had been waiting for. The county finally issued their ruling. The HOA had failed to provide sufficient evidence of their claims, and the fence was deemed an illegal structure. The HOA was given 30 days to remove it, or they would face substantial fines. But that wasn't the end of it. The investigation into their broader practices was just beginning, and the county had already begun taking steps to review their actions. The board members were under scrutiny, and their power was rapidly diminishing. It was at that moment that I felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. The battle had been long, but it had been fought with precision, intelligence, and an unwavering sense of justice. The quiet power of the truth had dismantled the HOA's facade piece by piece until there was nothing left of their authority. The last act of the battle came when I stood on my property, watching the crew begin to dismantle the fence. As each piece came down, I couldn't help but smile to myself. The gate that had once been a symbol of their control now lay in pieces, and with it their power was slowly crumbling. The final moment of victory was not loud or dramatic. It wasn't a public spectacle. It was the quiet satisfaction of seeing right prevail. It was watching the fence come down, knowing that it was a small but significant step toward justice. And as I stood there watching the workers finish their task, I felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't about the fence, it wasn't about the HOA. It was about something far more important. The quiet strength of standing up for what's right, even when no one expects you to. And with that thought, I turned and walked back toward my house, knowing that I had won. The days that followed felt like a quiet ripple across a still pond. The HOA's attempts to reclaim their power fizzled out as quickly as they had started. The fence, which had once been a symbol of their overreach, now lay in pieces, a reminder of their failure. But the real victory wasn't in the physical destruction of that fence. It was in the change that had rippled through the community, in the shift that had occurred behind the scenes. I stood at the edge of my ranch, looking out at the open land that had always been mine, but that had almost been taken from me. The air felt lighter now, as if the tension that had once clung to every corner of my property had finally lifted. It wasn't just the removal of the fence that gave me peace. It was the knowledge that the HOA had been exposed for what it truly was, a corrupt, power-hungry entity that had overstepped its bounds. And in the end, they had been forced to face the consequences of their actions. But more than that, the victory was personal. It was about knowing that no matter how quiet or understated my approach had been, I had stood up for what was right. I had used the tools at my disposal, the law, the evidence, the quiet strength of persistence, to dismantle a system that had taken advantage of vulnerable people for too long. The HOA had tried to destroy my peace, to undermine my rights. They had underestimated me, and now I had restored the balance. As the weeks passed, I watched as the HOA board members, who had once held such power, began to lose their influence. One by one, they resigned, unable to withstand the pressure of the investigation and the public backlash. The community's voice had grown too loud, too unified to ignore. The HOA, which had once acted like a kingdom with no limits, was now nothing more than a shadow of what it had been, and the people, the very residents they had tried to control, were reclaiming their power, finding their voices again. I received messages from neighbors, some I had never met, thanking me for what I had done. They spoke of how they had been afraid to speak out before, how they had lived in fear of retaliation, but now they felt empowered. They knew that it wasn't just about fighting against an unfair rule or a corrupt system. It was about standing together, about creating a community where each person had a say, where no one was above the law. In some ways, my fight had ignited something far bigger than I had ever anticipated. The media coverage continued, though it had quieted down somewhat. The HOA board was under investigation, their finances scrutinized, their dealings exposed. The larger impact was unfolding, and I was content to stay on the sidelines, allowing the process to run its course. I had done my part, and the rest would take care of itself. One evening, as I sat on the porch of my cabin, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about the journey. It had started with a small, almost insignificant injustice, a fence that shouldn't have been there, an overreach that seemed trivial at first. But the more I looked, the more I saw the bigger picture. It wasn't just about a fence or a piece of land. It was about the very idea of what was right and wrong, about standing up to those who thought they could control others without consequence. The feeling of satisfaction wasn't one of anger or revenge. It wasn't a vindictive triumph. It was the deep, peaceful knowledge that justice had been served quietly, methodically, without a single shout. The quiet power of the truth had done what it needed to do, and the world had shifted, just a little, because of it. And in the end, that was enough. As I watched the stars begin to twinkle above the ranch, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over me. The quiet strength of standing up for what was right had carried me through, and it was the same strength that would carry the community forward. I didn't need recognition or applause. The true victory had been in the transformation, in the quiet ripple that had spread out and touched the lives of everyone who had been affected by the HOA's actions. The final chapter of this story wasn't about a grand gesture or an explosive conclusion. It was about the lasting legacy of what had been set in motion, the restoration of justice, the reclamation of peace, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is the ability to wait, to plan, and to strike when the time is right. The HOA had lost, not because of a confrontation, but because they had underestimated the power of what they had tried to take away. In the end, they couldn't control what was mine, and that, I thought, was the truest form of victory.